Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we got a question from Darth EJS Mont, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think Darth Vader is a good Sith? In general pop culture, he is viewed as the ultimate bad guy, but in my opinion, for most of the time, he's rather Palpatine's slave and a broken human. There are two scenes when he behaves like a Sith, proposing Padme to rule the Empire, and asking Luke to join him. Apart from that, I don't see him exploring the dark side, gaining new knowledge, etc. In Rebels, he says Emperor this or Emperor that, and seems to lack his own agenda. In non-canon stories, like The Force Unleashed, he fails to even stand against the Emperor, betraying his apprentice instead. To wrap it up, I don't see Vader as a careful student of the dark side, rather a dangerous slave to the true Sith, Sidious. What do you think?" And I do kind of see where you're coming from here. I don't know that we necessarily see Vader doing a ton of truly Sith-like things or pursuing Sith knowledge or dabbling in some of the more unnatural abilities of the dark side. I don't know that he does a lot of what we'd consider to be Sith things beyond trying to, overthrow or kill Palpatine to become the Master, which is a very Sith thing to do, as Lucas himself has even talked about.
Every time you get two Sith together, you have the Master, you have the apprentice, and when the apprentice is always trying to recruit another apprentice to join with him to kill the Master.
Though I think part of the problem is that in the films, at least, or in the original trilogy films, it's not really his story anymore like it was in the prequels. It's not told from his perspective in those films, in the OT films, and so we don't really know what he's up to beyond his part to play in this story, or in Luke's story. Yes, there are books and comics in both the new and old canon and games like The Force Unleashed, which you brought up, but there are indeed other stories out there where, yes, we see him pursuing his own sort of goals and not always just being the Emperor's lapdog. And I do think there are some good examples of him being truly Sith-like to be found in some of those stories. Or we get a sense that he, again, does want to take out Palpatine and become a master like all good Sith want to. But again, in the original trilogy, starting in Empire Strikes Back mainly, after he has found out that he has a son or that Padme gave birth before she died somehow, well, that becomes his one and only concern or obsession, really. To turn his son to the dark side and to rule the galaxy with him is all he really cares about or can focus on anymore. And I think, especially after the prequels, after we get the full story of Anakin and his backstory, his fall to the dark side, and how it was mainly because of the desire for control because he couldn't stand the thought of losing the ones he loved and cared about. But especially after that story, I think we can understand better why turning Luke to the dark side does become this all-consuming obsession of Vader's, and it's not just because he likely fully believes that with Luke being as powerful as he no doubt is, that he'll be able to help him defeat Palpatine and ascend to the role of Sith Master. That is certainly part of it, yes. But likely there's a part of Vader, or maybe I should say a part of Anakin, the part that eventually grows and overcomes Vader and returns to the light. But there is a part of him that perhaps likes the idea of ruling the galaxy with his son. The guy who used to love Padme, who used to be, again, all about the people he cared about, probably finds that very appealing. He might even feel like he'll be able to trust him more than he would another apprentice, a random apprentice, since he is, again, his son. And not to completely hijack your question, I think this goes along with it nicely, actually. But another rather interesting question is, what exactly happens if Luke takes Vader's offer in The Empire Strikes Back and joins him? Assuming that, yes, they can defeat Palpatine together, which I think, especially if Luke gets some dark side training from his father, but I think together they can take down Palpatine. And after that, what exactly happens with those two? Do they somehow find a way to break the, let's call it Sith curse, this little problem the Sith tend to have where they just cannot ever truly be on the same page with each other because, again, as Lucas said, the apprentice is always trying to kill the master and take his place, and the master is always careful not to let the apprentice get too strong so that they can pull that off and take their place, and thus is pretty much always looking to bring in some fresh, eager blood to take out the current apprentice to become the new one, and the cycle goes on and on. But would the bond between a father and son be strong enough to sort of overcome that cycle, to overcome the power of the dark side, the power of corruption it possesses, where everyone who falls to it eventually surrenders to it, surrenders to the fear of losing what you have, of losing everything you have gained and not getting everything you want, and then sees anyone and everyone as a threat to take it all away? Now, I certainly think their bond could save them from that fate for a time, and I certainly think longer than most Sith Masters and Apprentices bonds last, especially with, again, the reason Vader falls to the dark side in the first place being his desire to save the ones he cares about, and that what Luke's potential path to the dark side seems to be, or almost was if we look at what happens when Vader threatens Leia in Return of the Jedi. But I think Luke has a very similar issue to his father. He cares a great deal about his friends and family, and he will do anything, risk everything for them. In fact, Luke's refusal to give up on his father is what ultimately saves his father and brings him back to the light. And so, in a manner of speaking, could or would Luke have a similar feeling towards his father if he had fallen to the dark side and joined with him? Would Luke's, I guess we could call it love and or faith in or for his father, be able to hold the fear at bay, the fear of not being as powerful as he could be because he's living in Vader's shadow, essentially, and thus always being at his father's, his master's, mercy, in a manner of speaking as well? Could Luke, as a Sith, stay his father's apprentice indefinitely and be happy with that without looking to recruit someone to take his father out and to take his place? And on the flip side, could Darth Vader resist trying to replace his son as he watches him grow more and more powerful, maybe even more powerful than he is ultimately? And I think a very fun and interesting what-if story could be this very scenario, where Vader and Luke defeat Palpatine together, and then they take over the Empire, take over the galaxy, and rule it as father and son. But then you bring in, say, Mara Jade, a sort of a love interest and potential apprentice of Luke, and she tries to convince him that they could rule better than him and Vader, or that he'd be happier not being in the shadow of his father any longer, and that his father is eventually going to try and take him out because he, Luke, has become too powerful, more than powerful enough to take out Vader. I think that would be a pretty interesting story. However, long story short, I guess, I think Vader said it best when he once told Luke that he didn't know the power of the dark side. And thus, eventually, after a pretty long and glorious reign, from a certain point of view anyway, from the Sith point of view, and not the point of view of the rest of the galaxy, but I think one would ultimately betray the other. I don't think two Sith, even father and son, or any strong relation, can ever find a way to overcome the power of the dark side indefinitely. Eventually it wins out, and eventually one would turn on the other, with my vote being Vader turning on and betraying Luke first. And I say that because Vader or Anakin would simply be further gone than Luke was. In fact, I honestly don't know how much Vader would really care about Luke being his son and ruling the galaxy with him. I mean, yeah, as I said, there is certainly a part of Vader that maybe really likes that idea. But there's likely a much, much bigger part of Vader that is just using all of that against Luke and to try to turn him. A part of Vader that understands, as we see him in Empire Strikes Back on Cloud City, that Luke has just fallen for the bait he laid out and has come to save his friends. And that shows us that Vader no doubt understands that Luke's friends are his quote-unquote weakness, and him, Vader, putting that offer out there to rule as father and son is kind of trying to appeal to that, to use the weakness against Luke, even though Luke certainly doesn't want to think of him as his father, or even believe it could be true that Obi-Wan would have lied to him about it. Also, as I've discussed before, I think what actually starts to bring Anakin back to the light isn't finding out that he has a son, or that somehow his children or one of his children survived. I mean, that is a foundation of it, I guess, what allows the door to eventually be opened. But I've always believed that for Vader, it's that Luke, his son, not only rejected his offer in The Empire Strikes Back, rejected the galaxy being handed to him essentially, but that Luke would rather potentially fall to his death and die than be anything like his father. That, for me, that realization that Luke is rejecting not only the offer, but rejecting who his father is and has become, is the moment Anakin begins to return. And so in our alternate reality where Luke simply joins Vader on the spot or joins him right in Empire, I don't think that opens the door wide enough for Anakin's return, and Vader continues to be the dominant force there and eventually turns on Luke, before Luke would ever think of turning on him. However, if Luke turned later down the road after Anakin had started to come back, like in Return of the Jedi when confronting Palpatine, well, that might be a different story entirely. Alright, I think that's going to be all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn. Take to the comments below and tell me what you think about any of this. Is Darth Vader a good Sith? And what happens if Luke joins Vader? Do they rule happily as father and son, or does something eventually go wrong? Also, you can feel free to ask a question for a future lightning response video. Just start your comment off with "Hey Thor," ask your question. I try to answer it in a future video. Whatever the case may be though, leave your comments or questions below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.